Why do tomato plants look incredible at the start of summer, then suddenly seem to fall apart right when the fruit should be coming in strong? One week, the plants are covered in flowers and green tomatoes. The next week, the leaves start yellowing, the fruit cracks after a rainstorm, and black rot starts creeping across the bottoms. Most gardeners think the problem is fertilizer, bad weather, or maybe just a weak variety. I used to think the same thing. But after messing this up for years, I realized the real problem was something I was doing almost every single evening without even thinking about it. And honestly, I thought I was helping. Every night after dinner, I would grab the hose, walk out to the garden, and give each tomato plant a quick soak. The soil looked dark afterward, the leaves looked healthy, everything seemed fine. But the weird part was this: no matter how careful I tried to be, I kept running into the same problems every summer. My Roma tomatoes would get blossom end rot, bigger slicing tomatoes would split wide open after heavy rain, lower leaves turned yellow by midsummer. Some plants just stopped producing even though they looked huge and healthy earlier in the season. At first, I blamed everything except the watering. I blamed the heat, I blamed the seeds. One year, I even convinced myself the soil must be missing nutrients, so I bought extra fertilizer and calcium products trying to fix it. None of it really changed anything. And here is the part nobody explained to me back then: tomatoes are not supposed to live on tiny little daily drinks of water. That sounds obvious now, but I genuinely did not understand what was happening underground. Most gardeners never really see the root system, so we end up judging the plant by what is happening above the surface. Green leaves must mean healthy roots. Wet soil on top must mean enough water. That is what I thought, anyway. Then, a few years ago, I started reading more about how tomato roots actually grow, and one detail completely changed the way I looked at watering. A healthy, mature tomato plant can send roots surprisingly deep into the soil if conditions allow it, much deeper than most people realize. These are not delicate little houseplants that want constant shallow moisture sitting near the surface. They are built to search downward. And once I understood that, I started realizing my watering routine was accidentally training the roots to stay weak. Because think about what happens during quick daily watering. You spray the surface for a minute or two, the top layer becomes wet, but deeper down, the soil often stays dry. So naturally, the roots stay close to the surface where the moisture keeps appearing every evening. At first, that does not seem like a big deal. The plants still grow fast in early summer, the leaves stay green, everything looks healthy from a distance, but the real damage is happening underground. Those shallow roots dry out fast the moment hot weather arrives. The upper layer of soil heats up quickly during the day, especially in raised beds and containers. By afternoon, the plant is already stressed again. Then in the evening, it gets another quick drink. Wet, dry, wet, dry, over and over. And that constant swing is where so many tomato problems begin. I did not realize it at the time, but I was basically forcing the plants into stress cycles every single day while thinking I was taking care of them. The first clue came one especially hot summer. I remember walking outside one afternoon and seeing the plants drooping badly, even though I had watered them less than 24 hours earlier. That confused me. I kept thinking, how could they already be thirsty again? So I checked deeper in the soil for the first time instead of just looking at the surface. The top inch felt dry and dusty, but a few inches lower, parts of the soil were still damp while other sections were already drying unevenly. The roots were mostly crowded near the top where the quick watering had trained them to stay. That was the moment things started clicking for me. The issue was not simply how much water I was giving the plants, it was the pattern. And once I understood that, I started changing the way I watered completely. The first thing I changed was honestly the hardest habit to break. I stopped watering every single day. That felt wrong at first, really wrong. For years, daily watering had felt responsible to me. If the weather was hot, I watered. If the leaves looked a little droopy, I watered. Sometimes I watered just because I happened to be standing near the garden with the hose already running. A lot of gardeners do this without realizing it. You see dry soil on the surface and your brain immediately says the plant needs water. But tomatoes can be incredibly misleading that way because the top layer dries out much faster than the soil underneath. And here is the part that changed everything for me. The surface of the soil tells you almost nothing by itself. One afternoon, I remember checking the bed after a hot day. The top looked bone dry. Normally, I would have watered immediately. Instead, I pushed my finger several inches into the soil near the plant. A few inches down, the soil still felt cool and slightly damp. The plant was fine. I had probably been overwatering for years simply because I kept reacting to what the surface looked like instead of what the roots were actually experiencing. That one small habit changed the entire way. I approached watering. Now, before I water tomatoes, I always check deeper down first, not just the top inch, a few inches into the root zone. If the soil still feels cool underneath, I wait. If it feels dry deeper down too, then I water thoroughly. And honestly, this alone probably prevents more gardening mistakes than almost anything else I do now. Because here's what nobody tells new gardeners: tomatoes usually handle deep, consistent moisture much better than constant shallow watering. When you water lightly every day, the roots have no reason to grow downward. Why would they? Water keeps showing up near the surface every evening. But when you water deeply and then wait a little longer before watering again, something different happens underground. The moisture sinks farther down into the soil. Then, as the upper layer slowly dries, the roots start chasing that deeper moisture instead of staying crowded near the top. That is how stronger root systems develop. And stronger roots change everything once summer heat arrives. I started noticing the difference pretty quickly after changing my routine. The plants stayed steadier during hot weather. They did not wilt nearly as fast during the afternoon. Growth stayed more consistent deeper into the season, but the biggest difference showed up in the fruit itself. Far fewer tomatoes started cracking. That was the part that really surprised me. For years, I thought cracking happened mostly because of rain. And yes, heavy rain definitely contributes to it, but uneven watering before the rain is usually what sets the stage. Here is what was happening in my garden before. The plants would spend days drying out near the surface because the shallow roots could not hold moisture very well. Then suddenly they would get hit with a heavy watering or a rainstorm. The fruit would swell too quickly and the skins could not keep up. That is when tomatoes split open almost overnight. Once I started keeping moisture more consistent deeper in the soil, the problem became much less common. Same garden, same climate, same tomato varieties, different watering rhythm. Blossom end rot improved too. And honestly, that problem frustrated me for years because I kept trying to fix it with supplements instead of fixing the actual cause. I remember buying calcium sprays one summer thinking that had to be the answer. But the tomatoes still kept developing those black sunken spots on the bottom. What finally helped was steadier watering. Because most of the time, blossom end rot is not about missing calcium completely. The plant struggles when moisture keeps swinging between too dry and too wet, everything becomes inconsistent. Once the watering stabilized, the fruit stabilized too. And this is where I think a lot of gardeners accidentally make things harder than they need to be. We try to micromanage tomatoes constantly. Tiny drinks every evening, panic watering during hot afternoons, watering by schedule instead of checking the soil first. I did all of that, but tomatoes actually respond better when you slow down a little and let the roots do some work between waterings. That was a huge mental shift for me. Instead of thinking, how often should I water? I started thinking, how deeply can I water so the plant stays stable longer? And honestly, that one change completely reshaped the way my garden performed by midsummer. Once I stopped watering every day, the next mistake became painfully obvious. I was watering way too fast. For years, I would stand there with the hose spraying the base of the plant for maybe 20 or 30 seconds, then move on to the next one. In my head, that seemed like plenty of water. The surface looked soaked afterward, but most of that moisture was never reaching the deeper roots. Some of it evaporated quickly, some ran sideways across the soil, and some only soaked the upper layer where the weakest roots were already crowded together. That is when I started slowing everything down. Now, when I water mature tomato plants during the hottest part of summer, I usually place the hose near the base on a slow, gentle flow and leave it there for a few minutes. Nothing fancy. No expensive setup, just slow watering instead of quick spraying. And the difference was immediate. The soil absorbed the water more evenly, moisture soaked deeper instead of disappearing from the surface an hour later, the plants stayed steadier through the heat. And honestly, the garden became easier to manage too. That was another thing I did not expect. I assumed deeper watering would mean more work, but the opposite happened. Because once the roots started growing deeper, the plants stopped acting stressed every single afternoon. I was not constantly reacting anymore. That changed the whole feel of the garden. And here's another mistake I kept making for years without realizing it. I was watering the leaves almost as much as the soil. A lot of gardeners do this automatically, especially with spray nozzles or sprinklers. You stand there spraying the whole plant because visually it feels satisfying. Everything looks refreshed afterward. But wet leaves can create a completely different set of problems once summer humidity kicks in. I learned this the hard way after dealing with fungal disease almost every July. At first, I thought it was unavoidable. Midsummer would arrive. Lower leaves would start spotting and yellowing, and slowly the plants would look worse and worse from the bottom upward. I blamed the weather again. Turns out, my watering routine was helping create the perfect conditions for those problems. When leaves stay wet for long periods, especially overnight, fungal diseases spread much more easily. Warm temperatures and trapped moisture are all they need. That is why now I focus almost entirely on watering the soil itself instead of spraying the whole plant. The difference is huge. The plants stay cleaner, the lower leaves stay healthier longer, disease pressure seems noticeably lower by the middle of summer, and morning watering helped too. For years, I watered in the evening, mostly because that was when I had time. Dinner finished, sun going down, hose comes out, pretty normal routine. But morning watering works much better for tomatoes, in my experience. The soil absorbs moisture before the hottest part of the day arrives. Any water that accidentally splashes onto leaves dries faster after sunrise. And the plants head into afternoon heat already hydrated instead of trying to recover overnight. That change alone made the garden feel more stable during heat waves. And speaking of heat, this is where shallow roots become a massive problem because the upper layer of soil heats up incredibly fast during summer afternoons, especially in raised beds, containers, or anywhere with strong direct sunlight. If most of the roots are trapped near the surface, the plant starts struggling much sooner once temperatures climb. I remember one stretch of brutal heat a few summers ago where neighboring gardens looked rough by early afternoon. Leaves curled, plants drooped badly, fruit started developing more cracking problems afterward. Meanwhile, my tomatoes were holding up much better than they used to. Not perfect. Tomatoes still struggle during extreme heat sometimes, but the difference compared to previous years was obvious. The deeper watering had created stronger root systems, and stronger roots gave the plants a much better buffer during stressful weather. And this is the part I wish somebody had explained to me years earlier. Tomatoes are not fragile little plants that need constant rescue. In fact, over helping them can sometimes create weaker plants. I know that sounds strange, but it is true. Every time I rushed outside giving tiny, shallow drinks because the surface looked dry, I was accidentally keeping the roots dependent near the top. The plants never had a reason to dig deeper. Once I backed off and started watering thoroughly instead of constantly, the entire garden became tougher. Not overnight, but gradually, week by week, the difference became really hard to ignore. Then came the thing that honestly surprised me more than almost anything else: mulch. I knew gardeners talked about mulch all the time, but for years I treated it like some optional extra step that mostly made beds look tidy. I did not think it could seriously affect tomato production. I was wrong about that too. The first season I heavily mulched my tomato bed. The difference became obvious within a couple of weeks. Before that, bare soil in my garden dried out incredibly fast during summer. You could water in the morning, come back later in the afternoon, and the surface already looked dusty again. And every time that happened, I felt tempted to water again. That was part of the trap. The exposed soil kept pushing me back towards shallow, frequent watering because visually it always looked dry. Then one year I spread a thick layer of straw around the tomato plants after the soil had warmed up properly. Not a tiny layer either, a real layer, a couple inches deep around the entire root zone while keeping some space around the stems themselves. And suddenly the soil behaved completely differently. The surface stayed cooler, moisture lasted much longer between waterings. The beds did not swing from soaked to dry nearly as fast anymore. Honestly, it felt like the whole garden calmed down. That is the best way I can describe it. Before mulch, summer watering always felt reactive. The heat showed up and I felt like I was constantly trying to catch up. After mulch, everything became steadier. The plants stayed more consistent during hot stretches. The soil underneath remained dark and slightly damp much longer. I was watering less often without stressing the plants. And here is the part nobody explained to me when I first started gardening. Bare soil loses moisture fast, faster than most people realize. Direct sunlight hits the surface all day long. Heat builds up quickly, wind pulls moisture out even faster, then gardeners see dry soil and panic water again. I did that cycle for years. Mulch interrupts that whole pattern. Instead of the sun beating directly onto exposed dirt, the mulch layer shields the soil underneath. Moisture stays trapped longer where the roots can actually use it. The difference during heat waves was huge in my garden. And it was not just about watering less often either. The plants themselves looked healthier deeper into summer, leaves stayed greener, growth stayed more stable, fruit production held longer instead of crashing halfway through the season. I even noticed fewer weeds competing around the tomatoes once the mulch layer was thick enough. That helped more than I expected too, because weeds steal moisture constantly, especially during hot weather. Every weed growing near your tomatoes is pulling water from the same area the roots are trying to use. Once the mulch cut weed pressure down, watering became even easier to manage. But there is one mistake I made early with mulch that is worth mentioning. One year I applied it too early while the soil was still cool from spring. The tomatoes just sat there barely growing for a while, and I could not figure out why. Turns out mulch can slow soil warming if you put it down too soon in cooler climates. So now I wait until the plants are established and the soil has warmed properly before mulching heavily. After that, it works beautifully. And as the season moves forward, watering needs change too. This was another thing I used to misunderstand badly. Young tomato transplants do need more attention early on because their roots are still small and concentrated near the planting hole. During those first few weeks, I water more frequently while the plants are getting established. But once the roots spread out, I gradually stretch the time between waterings. That part matters. A lot of gardeners never adjust their watering rhythm as the season changes. They keep using the same pattern from transplant time all the way through midsummer. I used to do exactly that. But mature tomato plants with strong root systems behave very differently than fresh transplants. By peak summer, my best producing plants usually do much better with deep watering every few days instead of constant shallow watering. And when extreme heat arrives, I still avoid going back to tiny daily drinks unless the plants genuinely need it. Because here's what I noticed over and over again. Every time I slipped back into shallow, frequent watering, the plants became more dependent on it almost immediately. The roots drifted upward again, and the garden started feeling unstable again, too. Rain used to confuse me more than anything. I would get a heavy summer storm, the garden would be completely soaked, and then the next morning I would still stand there wondering if I should water again because it happened to be my usual watering day. Sounds ridiculous now, but I know a lot of gardeners do this. We get attached to routines. Tuesday watering, Friday watering, maybe a quick spray during hot weather just to be safe. The problem is, tomato plants are not following a calendar. And honestly, this was one of the biggest mindset shifts for me. I stopped treating watering like a schedule and started treating it like a response to actual soil conditions. That sounds simple, but it changed a lot. Now, after heavy rain, I do almost nothing immediately. I check the soil first. Sometimes the beds stay moist for several days afterward, depending on the weather, before I would have watered again anyway and probably stressed the roots without realizing it. And here is something I kept noticing every summer. A lot more tomato plants get damaged from overwatering after rain than from short dry spells. That surprised me at first. But once the soil stays overly wet too long, everything starts slowing down. The plants lose that healthy balance, lower leaves yellow faster, growth becomes sluggish. The roots basically sit there in constantly wet soil with no reason to stretch deeper. And meanwhile, gardeners keep adding more water thinking they are helping. I definitely did. There was one summer where I practically drowned a row of tomatoes because I got nervous during a heat wave. Every afternoon, the leaves drooped slightly, so every evening I watered again. At first, the plants looked okay, then slowly the lower leaves started yellowing. Fruit quality dropped, some tomatoes cracked badly after random summer storms, the whole garden just felt off. At the time, I thought the heat was destroying the plants. Looking back, I think my watering habits were doing just as much damage as the weather itself. And here is another interesting thing I noticed once I finally started watering more consistently. Flavor improved too, especially with paste tomatoes. Toward the end of the season, once the plants are loaded with ripening fruit, I sometimes ease back slightly on watering instead of keeping the soil constantly soaked. Not enough to stress the plants badly, just enough to avoid overloading the fruit with excess water right before harvest. The tomatoes come out richer and denser that way, but consistency still matters. Because huge swings between very dry soil and sudden soaking are exactly what cause trouble. I learned that lesson the hard way after a vacation one summer. I came home to dry, stressed plants, panicked, and absolutely drenched everything. A few days later, several tomatoes split wide open almost overnight. At the time, I remember standing there frustrated, thinking the rain must have caused it. But the real problem started before the rain even arrived. The plants had already gone through a big moisture swing. That is why steady watering matters so much more than perfection. And honestly, tomatoes will tell you a lot once you stop obsessing over rigid schedules and start paying attention to the plants themselves. Healthy tomato plants usually look strong and upright in the morning. Leaves feel firm, growth stays steady. Some afternoon drooping during intense heat is completely normal. That part used to scare me, but tomatoes often perk back up once temperatures cool later in the day. Morning wilt is what really gets my attention. Now, if the leaves still look limp early in the morning when temperatures are cooler, that usually tells me the plant genuinely needs a deep soak. Yellow, lower leaves combined with wet soil tell a different story. That usually means I need to back off instead of adding more water. And honestly, this is where experience slowly starts replacing panic. Because beginner gardeners often react emotionally to every little change. I definitely did. Curling leaves meant emergency, dry surface meant emergency, hot weather meant emergency. So the solution always became more water. But over time, I realized tomatoes are tougher than they look when the root system is healthy. That was probably the biggest lesson of all. Not how to water more, how to water smarter. There is one last trick that completely changed how easy deep watering became for me. And honestly, I almost ignored it the first time somebody showed it to me. An older gardener in my area had these incredibly healthy tomato plants during a brutally hot summer. While everybody else kept dragging hoses around every evening, his plants somehow stayed steady and productive with far less effort. So eventually I asked what he was doing differently. He pointed down beside one of the plants, and at first I barely noticed it. A plastic jug was buried in the soil with only the top sticking out above ground. That was it. Nothing complicated. No expensive irrigation system, no fancy equipment, just a simple container buried near the roots. He explained that he punched several small holes around the lower part of the jug, buried it beside the tomato plant, then filled it with water whenever the soil needed moisture. The water slowly seeped underground over several hours instead of flooding the surface all at once. I remember thinking it sounded almost too simple to matter. Then I tried it myself. And honestly, the difference was bigger than I expected. Instead of water evaporating quickly off the surface during hot weather, the moisture moved gradually into the deeper root zone where the plant could actually use it longer. The soil stayed steadier. The plants stayed steadier too. And maybe the best part was how much less time I spent standing outside watering every evening. That routine used to eat up so much time during peak summer. Now I could fill the buried containers, let the water seep downward slowly, and walk away while the roots absorbed moisture gradually underground. The first season I used that method consistently, I noticed fewer cracked tomatoes almost immediately. Blossom end rot dropped too. Not completely gone every single time, because gardening never works perfectly like that, but dramatically improved compared to previous years. The plants also seemed to hold up better deep into late summer when heat and inconsistent weather usually started wearing everything down. And honestly, I think that is why this whole topic matters so much. Because a lot of tomato problems are not sudden disasters. They build slowly underground long before the visible symptoms show up. Weak, shallow roots, constant moisture swings, surface watering that never reaches deep enough. Daily habits repeated over and over until the plants slowly become more stressed without us realizing it. That was exactly what happened in my garden for years. And the frustrating part was that I genuinely thought I was doing everything correctly. I cared about the plants. I watered consistently. I paid attention every day. But caring and helping are not always the same thing in gardening. Sometimes overmanaging creates weaker plants. That took me a long time to understand. Once I finally changed the rhythm, everything else started improving too. The garden felt calmer. The plants looked steadier during heat waves. Fruit quality improved. Harvests lasted longer into the season. Problems that used to appear every single summer suddenly became much less common, not because I found some magical fertilizer or secret tomato variety, mostly because I stopped fighting the natural way tomato roots want to grow. And if there is one thing worth remembering from this entire conversation, it is probably this: tomatoes usually do better when moisture moves deep into the soil instead of constantly hovering near the surface. Deep watering encourages deeper roots. Deeper roots create steadier plants. Steadier plants handle heat, drought, and changing weather far better than shallow stress plants ever can. And honestly, once you see that pattern, it becomes hard to unsee it. So the next time you walk outside with the hose, slow down for a second. Check deeper into the soil first. Think about what is happening underground instead of just what the surface looks like. Because sometimes the difference between struggling tomato plants and incredible harvest is not more water at all. It is simply watering in a way that finally lets the roots grow the way they were meant to. And if you try changing your watering rhythm this season, I would genuinely love to hear what happens in your garden, especially if you have been battling cracking, blossom end rot, or plants that collapse halfway through summer. Sometimes one small adjustment changes far more than expected.